Hello, my name is Brian Wesley Johnson, and on behalf of Soulivity Magazine and Beyond Words Publishing, I want to welcome you to our second of our new Truth and Power series broadcasting live right here on Soulivity TV. We developed this series to bring together our national and international communities to discuss, debate, and create solutions to affect positive impact on our world. It is about inspiring and achieving the dream of more equality and equity, which results in true freedom for all of us. This is our mission here at Soulivity. We are an inclusive community dedicated to supporting everyone in living their best life, battling fear and ignorance wherever it may live. And today we have such a special show. As we celebrate Black History Month, we are discussing the facts and history of African Americans post-slavery and its effects on current conditions within this community of color and the American society more broadly. As part of this event, we have a wonderful charitable partner. For the next 30 days, we are trying to raise money to support the amazing Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture reach its goal for the 2021 year. And if please go to our Facebook page at Soulivity Magazine. And if you are so led, please donate or even join. And you can support the people and the great organizations whose mission is to provide opportunities for those who are interested in African American history and culture and to explore and celebrate that history as well. Now let's go ahead and introduce our phenomenal panel. I'm going to start off with Rochelle Riley. Rochelle Riley ended a 20-year career as a nationally syndicated award-winning Detroit columnist in 2019 to become the City of Detroit's first Director of Arts and Culture. In that role, she guides the city's investment in the arts and creates opportunities for transformational artistic expression and support. Her most recent project was the nation's first citywide memorial to the victims of COVID-19. 15 funeral processions that circled the city's Belle Isle passed 907 photo billboards of victims. Wow. But Rochelle also remains a writer. Her latest book, That They Lived, African Americans Who Changed the World, hit bookstores on February 2nd, 2021. The author, essayist, and arts advocate still host conversations around the country, or they did before COVID, with her current book, The Burden, African Americans and the Enduring Impact of Slavery, hosting conversations about the burden America still bears by refusing to deal with the aftermath of American enslavement. She was just appointed the co-chair of the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer's Black Leadership Advisory Council. Woo! Thank you, Rochelle.
Thank you.
Next up is Reverend Kevin Ross. The Reverend Kevin Kindrell Ross is a Southside Chicago native who now serves as the senior minister of Unity Sacramento, the first Unity Church in the state of California. He is regarded as a respected interfaith social justice leader, committed to building bridges of understanding and cooperation across race, culture, class, and religious lines. Whether in his role leading one of our nation's most diverse and integrated congregations, conducting diversity and implicit bias experimental trainings for faith and governmental organizations, or being an outspoken activist for healing the crisis between law enforcement and communities of color, Reverend Ross is dedicated to strengthening communities through dialogue, direct encounter, and education. Wow. And last but not least, for our first panel, is Jamon Jordan. Jamon Jordan is an educator, writer, and historian, also known as Baba Jamon. He has been a teacher of African and African American history for 20 years and a researcher of Black history for decades. He has given over 100 tours and presentations for the Detroit Public Schools, Walled Lake Public Schools, and numerous charter schools, as well as university class groups from Wayne State University, Michigan State University, Georgetown University, New York University, and the University of Michigan. His lectures on Detroit's African American history has been featured in the Detroit News, the Detroit Free Press, CBS Radio, Deadline Detroit, NPR, C-SPAN, CNN, in the History Channel, Detroit Public TV, WDET, and Michigan Radio. Woo-hoo-hoo! Y'all, we got the panel for y'all. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Brian.
Oh man, as we were talking before, I was telling you guys that I have been looking forward to this event for a long time. We were talking offline about the fact that we don't talk enough about our own history. And this is a golden opportunity for us to do that. And so I want to thank you for being here. Thank you for your willingness to join us and talk about what will probably be some tough things for people to hear, because there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we don't want to avoid any of it today. So buckle up, everybody. My first question to each of you is, this specific February for me has been kind of special given what we have gone through in the not to be named administration over the last 4 years. And my first question to each of you is going to be, what hero have you been thinking about in your own life over over this period in February specifically? So what hero have you been thinking about during this time? And I'll go to you first, Rochelle, if you're thinking of somebody.
Well, I'm always thinking of somebody, and I want to thank you, Brian, for having us on. I'm thrilled to be on with our city's preeminent historian. There's nothing about Detroit that I need to know that he doesn't know, and I'm thrilled to work with Jamon. And I'm also thrilled to meet the great Reverend Ross, Rev Kev, because is really doing God's work. I want to mention two things. I'm not the first director of arts and culture. I'm the first in 20 years.
Oh, so wow.
My first act was to meet with the last one they had in the 1990s, a woman named Marilyn Wheaton. And I told her my very first duty was to make sure that the city of Detroit was never without an Office of Arts and Culture again. The second thing is, was the first book. It came out in 2018 and it did well and people read it, but circumstances change. And since this is the first Black History Month of the Revolution, people are now requesting this one as much as the new one. And I'm thrilled for both of them. But both of them I owe to my grandfather. His name was Willie Benny Pitt, and people called him Mr. Benny Pitt, all three names. And I'm sure that he did that because we grew up in the South, in North Carolina, where there were people who would still call men boy. No one ever called my grandfather boy. And everything I do is in honor of him and because of what he did to make sure I had a career. And the second one, of course, is Fannie Lou Hamer, because we truly sometimes forget that as an African-American woman, and all of the African-American women in my family, we did not get the right to vote in 1920. I do not celebrate suffrage, 1920. I got the right to vote in 1965, thanks to Fannie Lou Hamer. So my mom, my aunts, and I, we owe our suffrage to her.
Wow. Wow. Thank you for that. Rev Kev, how about you? Who's been on your mind lately in terms of our history?
Again, I'm grateful to be with all of you. This is already a huge bright spot in my day in African American History Month. So I'm delighted. I have to go with two as well, and they happen to be women as well. The late Reverend Dr. Johnny Coleman, who was the founder and senior minister of Christ Universal Temple, the first Black mega church to be built in the first mega church to be built in the city of Chicago. But she was a powerful woman who inspired my life and career. And also Amanda Gorman. I am looking at her as a shero who is articulating the hope and the future of our nation. And the way she captured that powerful moment, where a standing president on his day, a vice president on her day, took back seat to the possibility and promise of this young Imagineer who overcame so much. So I'm thrilled with the past from my spiritual teacher, Dr. Johnny Coleman, but I'm also excited about the future from the Harvard student, Amanda Gorman. By the way, her grandmother served on my board of trustees, and a couple days before the event, she asked me to pray for Amanda, and no idea.
I love it. I love it. I love it. And how about you, Jamon? How about who's been on your mind specifically during this time?
So these are two Detroit historical icons that people may not know, but Dr. Joseph Ferguson was the first African American to graduate from what is now Wayne State University's College of Medicine. And so he graduated, but before he even graduated, when he's a practicing doctor, but not yet with a medical degree, but in the African American community, he's considered a doctor. There's a race riot in the city of Detroit, and he goes out in the middle of a race riot and administers healthcare to people, putting his own life in danger. And just thinking about what happened last year, this pandemic, and so many healthcare professionals putting their own lives in danger. And of course, some of them lost their lives. Some of them contracted COVID and passed away, giving care to other people. That there's this long history of African-American medical professionals doing that, putting their own lives in danger in order to assist the sick and the people who need that healthcare. So he's definitely been on my mind during this past year, really, not just this last month.
Wow. This is why I love y'all. I could have picked any one of those and I could have ran away with them. I don't know why. Well, I know why he's a giant, because we stand on the backs of our giants. John Lewis has just been on my mind.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
John Lewis and Representative Cummings, who is a student of him. They both have been on my mind in terms of, just the change, that's happened under their watch, but then the change in how our society has seen people of color from one administration into the next, and now back into this new administration. And I see them kind of looking over us and looking down on us and saying, okay, this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for y'all. Let's push the ball ahead. Truth and Power, the name is specific for Soulivity, because we can't get empowered without the truth first. And so that's why we named this Truth and Power. And I wanted to start, I was thinking about, okay, how do I want to start like our questions and conversation about different things? And I said, well, why don't we level set with folks, right? Why don't we have some level setting with folks around our history? And the Washington Post had a really, really good article lately, this month, about myths of Black history. And it was written by Keisha Blaine. I'm doing a shout out to her real quick so that she understands that we're going to be talking about it. And I wanted to go through, not all of them, but like 2 or 3 now, and then we can talk about some later in our segment where we're going to have another guest come in. And the first myth is that slavery was a Southern phenomenon. I think a whole bunch of people think that slavery was just germane to the South. And that is not true. And I see you nodding there, Javon.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So I'm going to let you give people just the snippet
Okay.
of what really went down and why that's not true.
So just very short, it doesn't have to take that long. What we call the transatlantic slave trade was the forced capture, enslavement, migration via the Middle Passage on slave ships to the Caribbean, Central and South America, particularly Brazil, and North America, particularly the 13 colonies, but also the New France and New Amsterdam. So the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Irish, let's break them down.
Okay.
Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, the British, and the Dutch were the main five. There were other groups involved as well, but those were the main 5 European countries, nations involved in the mass enslavement of Africans, wherever their colonies were in the Western Hemisphere. So the Spanish are in Cuba and Puerto Rico and in South America and Central America. The Portuguese are mainly in Brazil. The British are in Barbados and in Jamaica and the Virgin Islands and these 13 colonies. The French are in New France, which are in Canada, but they also have a place called Detroit. Everywhere these groups of people are, they're enslaving people.
Right.
So Africans are enslaved in all of these places. All of the 13 colonies had slavery before they became a part of before that was the United States. Every one of them, Massachusetts had slavery, New York had slavery. And after, or the areas that will later become part of the United States, places like New Orleans, which was a French territory, places like Detroit, which was also French, places like Florida, which was Spanish. Those places had slavery, and when they get folded into the United States, they will continue having slavery. So Detroit had slavery. And so slavery is not a Southern phenomenon. At one point, slavery was an all-American phenomenon.
Wow. Thank you for that. Rochelle, did you want to jump in on that one?
I just want to say I can remember the very first time I read about people who were doing that great migration, not counting the migration of the later century, but that great migration north to escape slavery, only to get into Detroit and be re-enslaved. And I thought, we journalists, we think we know everything. I read that and was horrified, because even though I knew it was not a Southern phenomenon, it just freedom. We're re-enslaved just like that, right there on the Canadian border, where you think that folks made it to there, they were able to go across the river, and they were not.
Wow. How about you, Kevin, Reverend Kev? I mean, you're from Chicago.
I am.
There's a lot of history there too. And what did you learn about in terms of the early parts of slavery there?
Well, growing up on the south side of Chicago with my grandparents who were from the South, they had some better history than what was being taught in the Chicago public schools at the time. And so a great deal of my education about the transatlantic slave trade came from my family. My grandparents migrated from Arkansas at a time when jobs, factory positions like GM and all of those were coming along. And so we had to learn those things about slavery at the dinner table, often growing up in that 3-story brownstone, which was a big deal at the time.
Right.
But I believe I learned correctly most of what I understood. In fact, I remember my grandfather saying that anywhere you go in this world, hold your head up high, because all over the world at one point, every economy in the world was dependent upon the efforts of your ancestors. So you belong everywhere there is land on this planet. It was paid for by your ancestors worldwide. We had those types of conversations.
Wow. Thank you so much. I mean, slavery was not germane to the South, y'all. It was everywhere. In fact, once Christopher Columbus hit the Caribbean, slavery was here. Period. Period. Okay. Why don't we move to this next one? And and we're moving. I want to make sure we got that done so that we could start moving into our main discussion. Here's another myth. Abraham Lincoln ended slavery and freed enslaved people. I know, y'all. I know you just kind of like, okay. And again, this is what this program is about. It's about exposing the truth. And I see you, Jamon, just like,
Yeah.
go for it,
So
man.
of course, this is something that I talk about a lot. So this is not a new thing for me. Let's start with the fact that in 1860, when Lincoln runs for president on the Republican ticket, he is not an abolitionist at that point.
Right.
Now, we can argue that by the time he is assassinated in 1865, he has evolved to become an abolitionist. But in 1860, he does not run as an abolitionist, and he is not an abolitionist. You can read his own writings. What he is opposed to the expansion of slavery in the new territories. So he's a moderate free soiler. There are radical Republicans in the Republican Party who are abolitionists. Charles Sumner is one. Thaddeus Stevens is one. In Detroit, we have Zachariah Chandler. He is a radical Republican and an abolitionist. And so they believe in not only the end of slavery, but they believe that Black people ought to be considered citizens and with equal rights. That's something else that Lincoln has not yet. He doesn't have that position in 1860 when he's running as president. So while he's president, the South will secede and there will be a war. Initially, Lincoln is trying to get around addressing slavery in this war. But the abolitionists are telling him, that's what the war is about. You're going to have to address this. The South has said, this is what the war is about. And so Lincoln is finally forced as a military measure to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. But let's understand something before we center Lincoln in this story. Black people, once the Civil War begins, Black people are escaping from slavery because they know now that there's a war going on against the people who are enslaving them. So if you see somebody fighting the people who are enslaving you, you're going to try to run away to the people who are fighting. So you got Black people escaping. You have small level slave revolts going on throughout the South, which is hurting the South's effort to fight this war.
Right.
You have Black people breaking the tools, burning the crops. You can read the letters of the wives who were left on the plantations, the Confederate wives who lived on the plantation. Their stories about what's happening on the plantation when their husbands are away fighting the war. And you can see that Black people are really engaging in a full-scale slave revolt throughout the South, which is helping the North win, right, which is helping Black people get their own freedom. And then when Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, it only applies to the states that are in rebellion. So it does not apply to the states that stayed on the Union side. But now those states don't listen to Lincoln. They're fighting a war with Lincoln. But those Black people, when they hear about this, they escape on a massive level. Right. And not only do they escape, they joined the Union Army. Almost 200,000 Black soldiers joined the Union Army, and they were not drafted. Some of them were in Canada. They had escaped from slavery on the Underground Railroad and living free. They come back to the United States to join this war to fight against the people who were enslaving them. Black people freed themselves. Lincoln, by signing the Emancipation Proclamation, you can argue that he provided an apparatus for Black people to continue freeing themselves. But Black people played a central role, and they had agency, and they acted on their own behalf. And Lincoln evolves on the issue of emancipation. He didn't start out that way, he evolves. But Black people will, in essence, free themselves.
Wow.
And that is the Black history that all kids of all colors should be learning. And that miseducation of American school children of all colors is why we have a race problem in America.
Yes.
That's the part that's missing, and that's what people need to know.
Yes. I know, Rev Kev, it seems like you want to get in on that too.
I'm just saying amen. You can't talk to historians. You don't need to ask I'm in total agreement. I believe it is miseducation that continues to give us a false sense of ourselves in society and what we can possibly achieve. Imagine what would be possible if young people actually, young Black people and young people of color actually saw themselves as instrumental in their own liberation, and what that does when their consciousness is expanded to that possibility, and why it is important for the oppressive class to keep the myth alive, because then it keeps a permanent underclass within our society. And so this history must continue to be told.
And that's the connection, everybody. You see where we're going with this, right? Where there is truth that leads to empowerment. And so we've got to tell the truth about what our history is. And it's our history. It's just not Black history. It's American history.
That's it.
All right.
That's it.
All right. We're going to take a short little pause for the cause. And when we come back, we're going to make a turn and talk about something that's really, really front and center, specifically that from what happened in 2020 with George Floyd, and that's law enforcement and policing. So we're going to make a turn toward that. So everybody stick tuned. We'll be right back with more Truth and Power. Okay. Soulivity Magazine and Beyond Words Publishing is pleased to announce its latest charitable partner, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. We ask you to join us in supporting this national treasure of memories and truth to stay alive for generations to come.
Creating this museum gives us a chance to make manifest the dreams of many generations. We call the lost dream back.
This is a milestone moment not only for the Smithsonian,
Soulivity Magazine and Beyond Words Publishing is pleased to announce its latest charitable partner, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. We ask you to join us in supporting this national treasure of memories and truth to stay alive for generations to come.
Creating this museum gives us a chance to make manifest the dreams of many generations. We call the lost dream back.
this is a milestone moment not only for the Smithsonian, but for the United States.
The goal of the museum is to make America better, provide opportunities for us to be made better by the past, and for us to move towards a future where race will always matter. They will find that those ideals are only met through sacrifice and struggle and a belief in a better day.
This place is more than a building. It is a dream come true.
History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived.
And by knowing this other story, we better understand ourselves and each other. I, too, am American.
We ask you to join us in supporting this national treasure of memories and truth to stay alive for generations to come. Soulivity Magazine and Beyond Words Publishing want to remind you about the importance of continuing to follow public health guidelines to protect yourself, your loved ones, and your community. Please continue to wear a mask, wash your hands, and watch your distance. Please visit these sites for further information about how to stay safe from COVID-19 into the new year. Remember, love protects us.
Police are supposed to protect and serve, but has that ever been the case for Black Americans? Today's baggage, how slavery helped create modern-day policing. Let's take it back to 1619, when a group of several hundred Africans were kidnapped from their village, forced onto a Portuguese ship, only to be stolen by English pirates at sea. After a voyage filled with horror and death, what's referred to as some 20 and odd Negroes arrived in the New World and were sold in a place now known as Virginia. Yes, enslaved Africans were in the New World before your beloved Pilgrims. These few Africans survived the perils of the transatlantic slave trade, which had been underway since the 1500s in the Western Hemisphere. During the slave trade, Africans were captured and forcibly brought to the Americas in ginormous numbers. Historians say that from 1526 to 1867, something like 12.5 million enslaved people were stolen from Africa and journeyed to the Americas. Only about 11 million arrived alive. Back to 1619. Those who did survive the horrors of the slave trade and were brought to what would become the U.S. were also subjected to the first form of organized policing in the South, known as the Slave Patrol. In case you missed it, the Slave Patrol and slave catchers were the first form of organized police in the South. These watching-as white folks first emerged in the colony of Carolina in the early 1700s and set the tone for policing as we know it. The Slave Patrol kept tabs on the whereabouts of the enslaved. And that meant if Black men and women were off a plantation, then the Slave Patrol could demand to see a slave badge noting their occupation. Slave Patrol could stop and search whomever's belongings just because. Now, I wonder who that sounds like. Then there was the slave catchers. That role is pretty self-explanatory. Slave catchers chased and returned runaways. They also intentionally scared the bejesus out of the enslaved to instill a sense of fear and prevent revolts. There was some overlap between the role of the slave catcher and the slave patrol, but together they enforced the idea that Black people were second-class citizens and that white people were the authority. And organized police departments, they enforced this racial hierarchy too. In South Carolina, for example, by 1837, there were dozens of officers in the Charleston Police Department whose jobs were essentially to monitor the enslaved. And though slavery was abolished after the Civil War, the spirit of tracking and policing Black folks lived on. During the Reconstruction era, Black codes were enacted with the quickness, and they restricted how Black folks could live their lives. David A. Harris is a law professor at the University of Pittsburgh. Harris specializes in law enforcement and race, so y'all know we're gonna have a lot to talk about. How did Black people's relationship with law enforcement change after emancipation?
Law enforcement often was cast in the role of enforcing Jim Crow laws and other kinds of laws aimed at maintaining the racial caste system and at keeping Black people, quote, in their place. So law enforcement, to the extent it existed, would be one thing for white people and another entirely for Black people. It was aimed at maintaining the racial separation that existed in their system of racial privilege for whites and second-class, at best, citizenship for Blacks. And this didn't only exist in the South. There were certainly law enforcement efforts that did the same thing in northern city towns.
But in the South, the system of racism wasn't just upheld by law enforcement. Vigilante groups like the Ku Klux Klan played a massive role in terrorizing Black communities with lynchings and other forms of violence.
You would find many powerful and prominent people to have been members of the KKK, including law enforcement. You would think today nobody in law enforcement would want to be out front as a member of the KKK. Of course, you wouldn't see that. But in those days, it was acceptable for many kinds of leading citizens to be involved, and law enforcement was no exception.
Case in point, Hugo Black, an ex-Klan member who went on to become a member of the U.S. Supreme Court. I digress. So for the most part, it was the responsibility of the police to uphold the law of the land, which in the South meant enforcing segregation. Police were oppressive and violent. This was well documented during the Civil Rights Movement, when at times they wore riot gear while using hoses and dogs on peaceful protesters. Why is the imagery of the police dog so important?
So you don't have to go far back into history to imagine people running away from slavery being tracked by dogs. But then we have actual documentary evidence in which we see dogs used as instruments of law enforcement and utter terror and just as weapons in the civil rights era. It's a weapon, literally, for law enforcement purposes, like a club or a gun would be. And it is also a message from history. Dogs have been used before in contexts like this, and they're being used now.
They sure are. This picture was taken just a few years ago in Ferguson. I think this is what they call deja vu. It's law enforcement who use dogs and other weapons of violence to instill fear in Black people. But the irony is that trigger-happy policing is in part caused by stereotypical fears held by the officers themselves. Darren Wilson, the officer who shot and killed Michael Brown, used fear as a defense, likening the unarmed teen to a demon. Police killings of unarmed Black and brown people have gone on way before Michael Brown and sadly will continue after him. Police are 2 times as likely to use force against Black and brown folks than white folks. We also know that policing tactics like stop and frisk, as well as racial profiling, are terribly discriminatory. Here it says that racial profiling by police has evolved to fit whatever agenda they might have against people of color in the U.S., targeting Black and Latinx people during the crack epidemic, Muslims after 9/11, and Central American migrants up until today.
The tactic has a long history. It seems to mutate to fit whatever problem can be blamed on a particular ethnic or racial group. It has never shown any degree of success, and yet it persists.
$1,000,000 question. Can policing in America be fixed?
I think the whole criminal justice machine, complex, what do you want to call it, must be vastly scaled. I think it's far too large. I think it has much too great a role in our whole society, and therefore it's too powerful, and it just chews people up and spits them out and does so more with certain communities than others. If you're poor, if you're Black, if you're brown, you have more to from it. It's a fact, right? So I think profound and far-reaching reforms are necessary in many places.
Today, we see reminders of the unquestionably racist history of policing in this country. From police in riot gear armed with dogs, to officers being caught in white supremacist Facebook groups, and cops on horses leading with a rope tied up like animals. The evolution of slave catchers and patrolmen to modern-day policing is undeniable.
It's important to remember that for Black people, law enforcement has often been on the wrong side of history. They were enforcing slavery all those decades ago and then enforcing Jim Crow. People remember that. Their grandparents tell stories. The photos are still there.
The photos still exist, but perhaps more importantly, so do the wounds.
Hey everybody, and we are back with our power panel here. What'd you guys think of that video? A lot of truth, right?
I think the same thing that every time I hear about a single shooting, how many more there have been like it and what it's going to take to stop it. I was really pleased with the work that the Washington Post did, where they actually documented all of these police killings. But every time I read this, since 2015, police officers have fatally shot at least 135 unarmed Black men and women. And I keep thinking, you know, that's a huge church choir. That's a big Boy Scout. That's a college class. We lose those people, and 75% of them were white officers who aren't required to learn anything that will help them with their multicultural understanding of how not to treat Black people as criminals.
Yeah. As this was playing, Jamon, we were I know you've done a lot of research and a lot of study specifically on policing and law enforcement and that connection. I mean, everybody, there's a great video. You can go out on YouTube and search for Jermon's name. There's a great video about the riots that happened in Detroit, and it's part of a tour that he's giving. It's a video of a tour that he's giving. But I wanted to, Jermon, give you a few minutes just to kind of talk through some of the connections that was part of that, but also some additional history that you're kind of thinking of that may be important for people to hear right now.
So sometimes when we talk about police relationships with the African American community and the negative relationship that the police have with the African American community, sometimes as historians even, we look for a origin. We look for, where did this start? You know, why did this happen? How did this begin? And as we look deeper at the relationship between what we call police departments today, professional police departments today in the African American community, we find that history, that negative history, really begins in the period of slavery. The proto-police departments, they're not quite police departments as we think of them today, but the proto-police departments that existed, these slave patrols, these paddy rollers, these slave catchers, these bounty hunters, these overseers, they work as a unit of what is enforcing slave codes against African Americans. And so the law for Black people who are enslaved are these slave codes. So we're not talking about, you know, it's against the law to rob someone, or it's against the law to commit murder. We're talking about it's against the law to read. It's against the law to try to escape and get freedom. It's against the law to talk back to an overseer or to a white person. It's against the law to prevent yourself from being raped by the person who's enslaving you. So these are slave codes. And these are the kinds of laws that this early group of pre-police departments are doing against African Americans. When slavery ends, or when African Americans escape to places that don't have slavery, because of the fugitive slave laws that have been created since this country was created. So the first fugitive slave laws inside the United States Constitution, but we'll get two later ones, the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793 and the most strict Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Once they're created, it turns all of the police departments in states that don't even have slavery, it turns them into slave catchers too, because now they're federally bound to help slave catchers, bounty hunters, and slave owners return people who've escaped from slavery. And so Black people have, since this country was founded, have always had this negative relationship with what we call police departments today. And so that early history really helps to inform where we are right now. After slavery ends, because of this doctrine of white supremacy, the new police departments will adopt that as part of their training. It may not be their formal training. They may not be taken to the side on training day and told that, but it is infused in the culture of policing that African Americans do not deserve the same treatment that you afford to white citizens because they're inferior. They're not quite as human. They don't have equal rights, and they ought not have equal rights. And so that gets infused in police departments. If you look at all of the videos during the civil rights movement, and you see them in Birmingham, and you see what the police departments are doing to these African-American nonviolent protesters in Birmingham, or you see them in Selma trying to march across from Selma to Montgomery, and you see Bloody Sunday when these state troopers attack these nonviolent marchers. You see it over and over again. It helps to inform us right now when we see unarmed and innocent Black people being beaten, killed, choked, and murdered by police officers. If you see what they did to nonviolent protesters in the 1950s and 60s, then it makes more sense. It becomes much more understandable what's happening to unarmed African Americans today.
Wow. Thank you, man. Thank you. Woo. You know, as you were talking, I was thinking about the movie 12 Years a Slave and the connection, right? Because a lot of people think, oh, well, everything was fine in the North. And you had all these people that were in the North, and they were, and you had black people that were free and doing that. And you did have some of those people, but you still had slave catchers that were actually grabbing
That's right.
free people too. That's all
That's
part
right.
of it, people. That's all
right.
part of the through line.
And you also have to remember that there was an economic empowerment that not slave catchers, but police departments, because the plantation owners needed that free labor back. So you could get arrested, a black person, for anything, and your choice was to go to jail or go back to the plantation. So there was still this perpetuation of slavery. And people tend to forget that because we don't talk about the economic impact.
No.
We don't talk about that really is what built America. Because if we talk about that, then we have to talk about what that meant and what is still meant by, having that free labor.
Kevin, I was reading, you were talking about before that you were really fortunate to be able to get more of the trueness of our history when you were growing up. I remember when I was growing up, I got two sets of history, right? There was the history that was taught by my parents, right? Where they were giving me a lot of this information. And then there was the history that was told in the public school system. And we're going to get to education in a minute. But that was there in terms of this whole policing kinds of thing where the economics guided law enforcement and policing strategy from day one. Black people were the economic engine. We were the ones who built the stuff. We were the ones who picked the stuff. We were the ones to transport the stuff. I mean, outside of our brothers and sisters on the West Coast that came later with the migration of Asian people, but we were doing all that. And so they had to keep us in line, right? And so, I was just thinking about that, and I want to get some of your thoughts about, the challenges that you saw growing up, and then later when it regards law enforcement.
I had a very unique upbringing on the South Side of Chicago, and I when I talked to my brothers about this, I grew up when there was community-oriented policing. There was such a thing in Harold Washington's, Chicago, Illinois, where he somehow impacted the law enforcement to really be conscious about this concept of public safety being one where the law enforcement officers actually lived in proximity to the people that they were policing. So I remember the officer friendly program where the officers would come to the school and introduce themselves. We knew our police officers, we knew our firemen, we knew our mailmen, we knew the butcher, and we knew these people growing up. I remember a time, and gangs have always been a part of the culture in Chicago, but I remember a time when officers were chasing gang members in my neighborhood, and they were able to identify me. Kevin, go inside, okay? Go inside. They knew I wasn't one of them, okay? When I left for Morehouse, something happened right in this war on drugs in terms of my particular neighborhood. With the onset of the war on drugs, policing changed very differently in our neighborhood. And when I talked to my brothers about their experiences with law enforcement being racially profiled, my brother was beat in front of our house by a law enforcement officer. The culture changed very rapidly in my particular community. So there's a lot I could say about how public safety is viewed related to law enforcement, depending on leadership at any given time. But I am fully aware of the ideological framework in which policing has been done throughout the history of the nation. But I had a unique kind of experience, personal experience growing up, where I saw both sides of that change. And of course, in my work today, being heavily involved in activism interacting with bad actors in law enforcement who are racially profiling, beating people. I drive in my car, real talk, I drive in my car today with a laminated insurance, my insurance papers, my identification, my registration is laminated. I can just pick it up just like this, because I got to get home. I've got 3 babies and a wife to take care of and a church to be concerned with. And I've had those chases. I would love to talk more when we get more into this discussion. I can kind of speak to what it's like now, you know, in terms of my experiences with law enforcement and what I understand today.
You know, that's a good point. I remember just even recently where I hopped in my car to run somewhere and I didn't have my driver's license and all that. And I immediately turned around and got that stuff in my wallet because of the fear of getting pulled over and what, oh, you don't have your driver's license. Whose car is this? You know, that kind of thing. And it's a fear. It's a definite fear for many people of color. And it's historic, as Jamon was talking about, where this is not just something new. Again, it goes to the myths, people. We're talking about the myth that this is just something that just popped up and it's, oh, well, why? You know, you must have been doing something and that kind of thing. That all started centuries ago.
And history repeats itself when we don't hear it the first time. Yes. You know, it dawned on me just recently that it was Bloody Sunday, the anniversary of Bloody Sunday last year, when a group of students, activists, clergy had, in our city in Sacramento, California, we were marching on a bridge in Sacramento, East Sacramento, very wealthy enclave, protesting the district attorney's decision not to prosecute the officers involved in the shooting death of unarmed Stephon Clark. And while there, the law enforcement had completely ramped up as if we were in 1965 or 4 or 3. The mounted horses, the batons, the pepper spray, the bullhorns, all of that advancing on us, forcing us out of this wealthy neighborhood. You had three law enforcement agencies that conspired against, around, at this point, about 84 individuals who were remaining in this demonstration. You had the county, you had the highway patrol, and you had the city. And they asked us to leave. And what was interesting, as we're leaving, and part of our role as clergy is to, get as many people home alive. And because they're different interpretations of what, of how to carry out, civil disobedience, generationally. Our role is to do as much as we can to make sure that these demonstrations are nonviolent, because sometimes we go and we volunteer to be arrested. But if a young person is with us and they have a DUI on their record and they have, they've got some previous charges, they don't know that, blowing up on the scene could be the end of their lives. Rev Kev's coming home, you know what I mean? Somebody's going to be there. So we play a significant role. That night, as we were being escorted out of that, really forced out of that neighborhood, coming across the bridge, we get to the other side of the bridge. This is in United States, California. We get to the other side of the bridge and there are law enforcement who have closed the bridge using an old tactic called kettling. Kettle, arms drawn against us. And of course, they started arresting leadership first, including myself.
Let's give some context here. What is kettling specifically? Where, let's give people, because some of these people don't know what we're talking about. I do. Y'all do. But let's talk about that a little bit.
This is a form of entrapment. It is literally forming a perimeter to cage a group of people. We're basically creating a human cage with law enforcement who are armed. So on one hand, we're getting one message thinking we're compliant, but the real intention there is to force us into a trap.
Right.
And that's exactly what happened. On that night, ironically, it turned out to be the anniversary of Bloody Sunday. Ironically, I can still hear the screams of the folks on that bridge, from that night, because the guns were coming. They had their guns drawn, and they were forcing us to the, when you're on a bridge and there's that little slim bit of sidewalk.
Yes, yes.
They were advancing on us, pressing us into the corner, and so we were, hands up, we're compliant, we're not resisting. But think about the young college students, think about the folks who were full of zeal coming out for the first time that night, being engaged, and the trauma that was created by law enforcement. There was one that was ready to shoot on us. He went out with his gun drawn, coming in at us, and some other white officer just had the presence of mind to say, he grabbed him back.
Wow.
Otherwise, all of those guns that were drawn at us were going to be popping off in seconds.
Right.
And this is America today. This is what's happening right now to known personalities. We've been having these tables with law enforcement, mayor, local, and this happens across the nation, local leaders talking about how can we ensure that in the context of these current demonstrations that we can ensure that there is nonviolence on both sides. And for weeks and months leading up, even to that particular march, we had been having these discussions with law enforcement, and the first opportunity they had to violate that trust, they did.
Jamon, I see you really feeling what Rev Kev is talking about here. I just want to make sure that we talk a little bit about, in this context, what do we need to take away from our history to start affecting change today as it regards to law enforcement? There's Black Lives Matter, and there's been, defund the police. But I want to get your perspective as a historian who understands the truth and then the reality of the connection between that historic truth and what we live today.
Yeah. Rev Kev said it earlier when he was talking about the South Side of Chicago during the time of Harold Washington, and what Harold Washington was able to create. And this has been done in a number of cities. The issue is we need to find a way to sustain that kind of policing. It lasts for a while, but at some point things change. So in the city of Detroit, there had been a long history of negative relationships between African Americans and the police department. And then, of course, there was an uprising in 1967. After that uprising, the police department created a unit called STRESS, Stop the Robberies, Enjoy Safe Streets. And what it really was an undercover, the easiest way for me to put it, it was an undercover assassination squad created by the Detroit Police Department. Coleman Young is a state senator at the time, and he's running to be mayor. And he's making that part of his campaign. A major part of his campaign is to get rid of STRESS,
right,
to get rid of this assassination squad, this group of plainclothes officers who would come into the African American community looking like they're just a poor or a drunk white person in a rough community with money coming out of their pocket. And then, of course, if you try to rob them or take the money, they pull out their guns and shoot everybody who tried to do it. Not arrest you, not take you to jail, but kill you.
Right.
The STRESS would have shootouts with other police officers, with African American police officers. They'd have shootouts with them. So they were just a Wild West rogue group of officers. And so when Coleman Young runs, he runs to get rid of STRESS. And when he becomes mayor, he's elected in the 1973 election, becomes mayor. Executive Order 1A is the end of STRESS. So he gets rid of stress. And then he creates a system of hiring officers from within the community. And so on the year he got elected, there are 3,954 complaints of police brutality by citizens in the city of Detroit. Within 8 years, after his second term, we have 854 complaints of police brutality. Now that's still not great.
Right.
I mean, that's not, you know, paradise, but compared to 3,900 and some, that is a major difference because the officers were coming from the community. There were African Americans on the police department who knew what it's like to look down the gun barrel of an officer who doesn't look like you, doesn't care about you. So they knew what that was like, and they were less likely to do that. Now, what we've learned since is that the longer officers stay on the force, the more you're going to have to do to try to circumvent them treating African Americans the same way other officers treat African Americans. But when Black officers first got on the force, and they began to make a change, and they saw themselves as parts of that community. And so that happened in the city of Detroit, just as it happened in Washington, D.C. What we have, in Chicago, what we have to figure out is a way to sustain that over the long haul, and that we don't have to reinvent the wheel every 20 years or so.
Right.
We need to be able to have that as an ongoing thing. And of course, one part of that, which historically has helped, is a civilian police review board. That ought to exist in every city, a civilian police review board. And the more independent they are, the more effective they are. So if they're chosen by the police department or by the mayor, they're not as effective as if they're created and chosen by the community.
Wow.
So the more the community has a stake in this group, the more effective they are in circumventing some of these events.
Excellent. You know, Rochelle, as Jamon and Kevin were talking about this, there's another obvious part in this too. We're talking about communities, right? Community policing, police who feel part of the community, and such and such and such. There was a time, I think it's ended now, but there was a time that all employees of the city of Detroit had to live in the city of Detroit. Mm-hmm. Remember that? Remember that, Rochelle? And I know you guys are remembering this too. That went away, and they allowed people to live outside of the city. Talk a little bit about that too in your own experience, because I know as an employee now of the city of Detroit, but also a loyal Detroiter. You know, I'm in DC now, but I still call myself a Detroiter. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, let me mention two things, because one is this criminalization of Black folks, which started in the 70s and early 80s, having mostly to do with drugs or some of the things that you could use to label, particularly. And all of a sudden, it became open season on everybody deciding, well, these are bad. Every time I see the difference in how young Black men and young white men, or Black people and white people, are treated as it has to do with crime. You've got, these misguided youths who shouldn't have been where they were, they say that whether it's an attack on the US Capitol or they were buying drugs somewhere. And then you've got people who want to send young Black men to prison for 30 or 40 years over the same thing. That criminalization is part of the problem. The reason people feel so strongly that your police officer should live in the community is because that's how you know, as Rev Kev said, that you see some kid and you go, oh no, you need to go home because I know you, as opposed to you seeing everybody the same way. You have to teach that type of education, and you can't make somebody care, because one of the things that is not done enough for any police department that I'm aware of, and I'm sure there are some that are in smaller, mid-sized, where you have to have some training in customer service, in caring, in how to deal with young people, and in cultural care, because they have this thing now with some companies where they talk about cultural competence, where you have to understand certain things, like if you approach a person a certain way, what that might feel like or look like to them. There's not an officer anywhere in America who should not understand now that if they approach a young Black man, he is going to feel differently about that approach than a young white man or a woman. Anybody who pretends like they don't know that, they're lying. They need to be fired. They don't need to be fired. We've had going on, and with the way that, you know, we've had to have that talk with our young sons and grandsons for years. That's the first thing. So you have to decide, number one, either you're going to make people live in the community and hope that that is enough because they get to know them. You're going to have to make people understand whether you live in the community or not. You need to know the community. You need to walk, know who's who and what's what, and that, you know, this is Kev over here. I know him. I talk to him. You can be an officer friendly. If you're not willing to do that, then that's when you deal with people saying, okay, we think if you lived here, you'd know better. It's just like newsrooms where, you know, you've got white editors who say, well, I'm going to hire some Black people and we're going to be fine. Well, if those Black people aren't necessarily interested in Black people, aren't necessarily interested in writing about Black people or talking about what's happening with you, have not made a difference. But if you have somebody who's decided, I'm going to come in and, as I did as a columnist, be unapologetically Black, write about, you know, issues of concern to Black folks because it's important, then you have made a difference. So that's where we are, and that's what has to happen. So like Jaman said, it has to be front and center. It has to be what, you can't declare that you're doing community policing and then that's it. You have to do.
Wow. Woo, you guys are on fire.
Is it space to tag on to that? Because I think
please.
This topic, we brought it up. It's been brought up today earlier, just talking about the movements to defund the police. I want to just speak a little bit to that, you know, because what we're saying is let's reimagine public safety.
Right.
Does an armed, mostly white officer need to respond to every emergency call that happens in the community? We have incidents of mental health that they are not prepared, equipped, or trained to handle, and the way they handle it, as we are seeing, especially when they're interacting with Blacks and people of color, it ends most often fatally. You know, so are there other individuals, groups, professionals, experts in our communities that can be called? And that's some of the work that we're doing in this state, our city council and even the governor, to really, the county, actually, we're still working on that county, boy, the county, whew, that's another story. But we pressed the mayor to understand that when activists are saying defund the police, there's a radical side of that, obviously. You know, some want to see it completely abolished and start over. But there is a space that I think is reasonable that can begin to provide services. For example, what was birthed out of this trauma that's happening for Black folks who continue to be re-traumatized every time we see on television an image of someone like that looks like us be shot and killed by law enforcement for no reason at all. We ended up creating in Sacramento what we call Safe Black Space. A Safe Black Space brings together clergy and African American or Black mental health professionals together to create circles that are Black spaces for individuals who are experiencing the kinds of trauma that comes with this environment that we're living in, that gives them the space to process through it in a healthy way, and also gives them an opportunity to be referred to for services that they may need, wraparound services that will allow them to function so that they don't go to work and pop off at the first white person that says the wrong thing and really run the risk of losing what they've worked all these years to face. So there are ways in which our own communities can begin to imagine how we create safety. Subsequently, we're working on what we call Grandma's Backyard. Stephon Clark in our community was shot and killed in his grandmother's backyard. And growing up, a grandmother's backyard was the safest place on the planet.
Yes.
And so we're reclaiming that idea of a grandmother's backyard from being a murder scene to being a safe space for traumatized Black youth and for artists, activists, clergy, and community who want to have authentic encounter around coming to know each other and do racial healing and reconciliation at some place. So we've devoted a plot of land on our property for that creation. At some point, we're going to have to become instrumental in what public safety looks like and get more involved locally. We often think that the national elections are the most important elections, but the pain is happening locally. We're seeing these things happen locally. And so our lack of information, our lack of being connected to those places where change can happen keeps us out of it, you know? Keeps us in these sick cycles. And so that's my 2 cents. I think that we can reimagine public safety to include more stakeholders who really care about our well-being as a whole.
Yeah, looks like we lost Rochelle. I guess she'll be back. Why don't we take a pause for the cause real quick? And we're going to continue this thread, but we're going to continue it in a different way. There, she's back.
My apologies.
It's okay. Hey, look, all this energy in this conversation is probably, you know, the internet's probably like ping, 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 ping. But we're going to continue this thread because when we talk about communities, we can't talk about communities without the history of how those communities were built, right? And so we're going to take a short pause. We're going to make this turn toward housing and economics, and we're going to welcome a very special guest, okay? So everybody stay there, stay where you are, and we'll be right back, okay?
Do you feel like you can be in better health? Do you feel like there's something missing towards your path of success? Hi, I'm Rachel Kaplan, owner and creator of Higher Health Now. I started this company 3 years ago to help my yoga community thrive off their yoga mat. What I realized is that there's people from all walks of life who need this training. Today, I work with professionals all over the world, explore what's holding them back from living their version of good health, and help them shed light on the action steps they need to take to bring about that positive change. Professionals like you who want to be better in their work, better in their relationships, and take massive action towards living your life purpose. That's the meaning of higher health. I'm excited to meet you and show you the path towards living your higher health now.
Soulivity Magazine and Beyond Words Publishing want to remind you about the importance of continuing to follow public health guidelines to protect yourself, your loved ones, and your community. Please continue to wear a mask, wash your hands, and watch your distance. Please visit these sites for further information about how to stay safe from COVID-19 into the new year. Remember, love protects us.
We've left untouched the biggest segregation of all that overwhelms everything else and hangs over our entire society, and that is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. There are clearly defined areas in every one that I've lived in that are all white or mostly white, or all African American and mostly African American. And all of us accept this as part of the natural environment. It's not that we think it's a good thing. We say it's too bad, but we think it's sort of natural, normal, something we accept. It's not that we've tried to do anything about it and have failed. We've never even tried.
And so in order to rationalize to ourselves our failure to undo it, we've adopted the national myth. And that myth is pervasive. It's pervasive across the political spectrum. The liberals and conservatives hold it. The blacks and whites hold it. The name of that myth is we have de facto segregation. Not something that was created by government like all the other segregations that we undid in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, but this is something that sort of just happened by accident. It happened because people like to live with each other of the same race. Or it happened because private actors, whether they were real estate agents or bankers or private citizens, discriminated in how they sold or rented homes. Or it happened because African Americans happen to be poorer than whites on average, and therefore they can't afford to move to middle-class communities. De facto segregation is an utter myth. There is no basis to it whatsoever. The racial segregation in every metropolitan area in this country was created by racially explicit government policy designed to create racial boundaries, designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another, with policies that are so powerful that they still determine the racial landscape that we see in cities all over the country. Just like we have the myth of de facto segregation, we also think we know what public housing is. It's a place where poor people live, where lots of mothers with children, single parents with children, lots of young men without access to jobs in the formal economy, acting out, engaging in oppositional behavior that attracts attention to the police and a cycle of violence that we've seen in so many places. That's what we think of as public housing. But that's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country as a program for middle-class, working-class families. During the Depression, poor people were not permitted into public housing when public housing was first created. There was a housing shortage, and public housing was created for people who could afford to pay the full rent in housing, and they did in public housing, but for whom there was no housing available. Everywhere, the Public Works Administration and the other federal agencies that succeeded it created segregated public housing, separate projects for African Americans and whites in cities all across the country, frequently segregating neighborhoods that hadn't previously been segregated, that were integrated. During World War II, the actions of the government intensified to create segregation. They intensified because throughout the country, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of defense production, of war production, to take jobs that hadn't existed during the Depression. And the migration of workers into centers of defense production overwhelmed frequently the communities where they were working. The federal government had to build housing for these workers if it wanted the ships to be produced. For the African Americans, they built the housing on temporary housing because the explicit goal of the housing was that African Americans after World War II would leave and go back to the South. So they built temporary housing for the African Americans along the railroad tracks and near the shipyards, and they built more stable housing for the white migrants in the white residential areas. Very soon after that, in the mid-1950s, a development occurred everywhere in the country, which was systematic, similar, and widespread. And that was that suddenly all the white projects began to develop large numbers of vacancies. All the black projects began to develop long waiting lists. And soon the situation became so untenable, so conspicuous. You couldn't have projects in the same city, some of which were virtually empty and the other of which had long waiting lists. The federal government and local housing agencies opened up all projects to African Americans. And then at about the same time, industry left the cities. Fewer and fewer jobs became available to the now increasingly and soon almost all African American population in the public housing. The population could no longer afford to pay the full cost of its rent, so the government had to begin subsidizing public housing. Maintenance declined in the projects. Prior to this, maintenance workers lived in the projects. They were paid good salaries and lived in the projects. Upkeep declined. The projects became vertical slums that we came to associate with public housing today. Another federal program that was perhaps even more powerful in creating racial segregation, and that was a program of the Federal Housing Administration designed to move white families out of urban areas into single-family homes in the suburbs. At a racially explicit basis, we created a white noose around every urban area with federally subsidized single-family home subdivisions. These were giant subdivisions in many cases. The most famous of them, I'm sure you've heard of it, is Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes in one place. What bank would be crazy enough to lend a developer the money to build 17,000 homes or 15,000 homes in one place for which he had no buyers? We were in a suburban country at that time. People thought the whole idea was lunacy. Who's going to want to live in a single-family home when they can live in the city instead? Any of these developers, the only way they could get the capital to build these giant subdivisions was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans for the development, for approval of the construction materials they were going to use, the architectural design, the layout of the streets in the subdivision, and
an explicit commitment not to sell a home to an African American, required by the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration even required, as a condition of these guarantees, developers like Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. These deeds still exist in these homes today. They're no longer enforced, no longer enforceable, but they're still there. What was the consequence of this? Well, those homes in those days, in all of these suburbs, they sold for $10,000 or less, $8,000, $9,000 a piece. In today's money, that's less than $100,000, probably $90,000. African Americans who were prohibited, not they didn't want to, not because they didn't like living among whites, they were prohibited from moving into these suburbs, and they could easily afford to do so. Any working class family can afford to buy a home for $90,000, roughly twice national median income. Those homes and developments like that now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 and more. The white families over the next couple of generations gained, you can do the arithmetic, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in equity. They used that equity to send their children to college, to take care of medical emergencies, to take care of economic downturns, most importantly, to bequeath it to their children, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans who accumulated none of that wealth as a result of this federal subsidy had none of those abilities. Today, nationwide, African American incomes are on average about 60% of white incomes. African American wealth today is 10% of white wealth. That enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy practiced in the mid-20th century that has never been remedied. It's a constitutional violation, and of course it determines the ongoing racial inequalities we have today.
You back? Well, let me get myself off mute here. And I want to welcome you back to our event celebrating African American history. And it is my pleasure to welcome to our panel Sasha Gay Angus. Sasha Gay Angus is the president and CEO of Manna Incorporated. It serves low and moderate income families, assisting them to fulfill the dream of home ownership in the Washington, D.C. area. Since 1982, Manna created and preserved nearly 1,200 units of affordable housing for low and moderate income DC residents, and homeowners have accrued over $160 million in equity. They also support financial literacy and home owner training programs, which has been replicated more than 200 times across the nation. So we want to welcome you, Sasha, to our panel. Oh, it's my pleasure. We were talking about community policing and law enforcement, and as Rev Kev, you were talking about reimagining that. But there's a through line that goes right to economics and housing specifically. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted you to be on the panel, Sasha, today, because as an expert in housing policy, and affordable housing, housing is like the cornerstone of economic wealth in this country. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I mean, this goes back into your own, your graduate studies where you were doing a fellowship that revolved around this as well. So you know the facts and truth that are aligned with the video that we just showed. So can you talk a little bit about that?
This whole idea of how housing policy affects wealth in this country is very crucial. There's a very direct connectivity, and frankly, to be clear, the wealth gap in America has never really been wider. It is wide, and it's just been growing over decades. you can tell from the video that historically African Americans have been disenfranchised as a result, of federal policies, such as redlining, where the government limited cities, okay, we're going to only invest in these communities where there's a green line, and those communities where there was investment were primarily white communities. And the communities that were redlined were primarily Black communities, okay? So Black communities did not become impoverished just by happenstance. It was it was because of disinvestment. And at the time, to be clear, during the Great Migration, when Blacks from the South, came to cities like Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, Tulsa, they were seeking a better experience, a better life, and seeking the right to exercise their right to vote, to own homes, to have a steady paying job. And as it relates to home ownership specifically, if a Black family is trying to buy a house and they're blocked out of the legal market to purchase a home, they're stuck. And so they were relegated to what's called contract buying, where, these contract brokers would essentially say to a Black person looking to buy a house, you're going to pay me the down payment and the monthly quote unquote mortgage on this house. But guess what? You're not going to get the deed of the house until you complete all the payments. Wow. And if you miss one payment, all the proceeds goes to the contract buyer, and that Black person loses their home. So when you consider that communities were redlined, right? So there's no money, no investment being spent in them. Black families may be buying or trying to buy in those communities, but they're dealing with contract buyers, they're dealing with real estate brokers or appraisers that are really setting them up for failure. And over a period of time, these communities broke down. They broke down because of disinvestment. So what you see that occurred in cities like Chicago, Detroit, a lot of the urban cities, it was not by happenstance. It was as a result of structural policies that really led to the disintegration of those communities. A bit about, there's a disproportionate system right now in terms of Black wealth and white wealth, okay? And of course, wealth means, owning, entrepreneurship. You may be able to accumulate wealth through entrepreneurship. Yeah. One may be able to accumulate wealth through real estate, business holdings, etc. And then one also needs income as cushion, right? But income can be lost through, health-related matters. Income, one can lose a job, etc. The aspect of wealth building is really important for African Americans, because the primary way in which they've been able to accumulate wealth is really through home ownership.
Right.
Whereas, white families have not had to rely on home ownership. as much. There is a study that came out from the Brookings Institute that essentially said that, Black median income in 2019 was about $44,000, whereas the median income for whites was $72,000 across the country. But Black wealth was 1/8 the wealth of white households. So we have a lot more work to do around this. We have a lot more work to do in addressing the systemic problem that we're facing today in terms of the wealth gap.
Wow. Thank you for that. I mean, and again, everybody, this is the truth. I mean, these are the facts and the history that we live in as a country, right? That has been there. And we're not just talking about that this is something that a small group of people were doing. This was actual policy at the local, state, and federal levels that blocked Black people out of the same opportunities that white families had. I'm also thinking about, Rochelle, I'm also thinking about another part of our history around how our communities were built was the blockout of things like the GI Bill or the New Deal or other things where Blacks weren't able to get that money, even though, like, for instance, like the GI Bill, Black soldiers died, and Black soldiers have died in every single war that America has fought, going back to even before the Revolutionary War. And so when Black GIs came back from the war, they didn't get any of that money. Or if there was a chosen few that might have gotten, but it was nowhere near the amount of money that white GIs got to rebuild their lives post World War II. Can you talk a little bit about your experience and the history around that as well?
Let's talk a little bit, and I'm so glad that Sasha gave us that brilliant breakdown so people can understand that in America, discriminating against Black folks was not just policy, it was the law.
Right.
Things were allowed for over a century. Here in Detroit, 2 years ago, housing, which is, considered affordable when it consumes more than 30% government, and attack that gap. That part is laudable. What you're talking about is literally a century of blockage that you cannot overcome overnight. So you still have to, you're being attacked 3 ways. I call it the triple attack: education, employment, and housing. So if you have a poor education, so you wind up getting the poorest of employment, you will never get more than the housing that you can afford. And in some cases, we're talking about, for renters in Detroit, median sort of renting cost, it's 48% of your income. So for food, clothing, healthcare, transportation, school, basic needs, people are actually living like that, and we are not. This is one of those things where in past times, Roosevelt would have done, his whole New Deal, and Lyndon Johnson would have done the New Society. I have those backwards, Great Society. But the bottom line is, it is pandemic level, and we're not dealing with it in a way that says we understand just how pervasive this is for Black folks. It touches every single thing in the way that we live. So if we don't treat it, in a way that shows that we do understand that generational wealth is not something that's available to African Americans, who at first it was illegal to teach us to read, and then it was illegal to give us proper jobs, and then it was illegal to try and give us proper education. Then it was illegal for us to try and buy houses. White people were leaving estates down for literally 200 years, so they already have wealth. Our former, social media influencer in chief out of the White House was not rich because of anything he did. He was rich because of money.
Right.
You do that with Black folks, which means you have to figure out how to go and do something massive to change that.
Wow, thank you for that. And we could go all day about this stuff, because it's deep. I mean, there's a lot of information, and everybody, we're just touching on the very, very, tip of this. It goes very, very deep. There's laws and policies that were discriminatory against Black people. Again, local, state, federal. There's a whole bunch of stuff that was happening at the local level too that was barring people from it.
Little thing, and I know you need to go to Rev, but this is still true, particularly for Black women.
Yes.
Who are married and you want to do something like buy a house, where I had to jump through hoops because I was unmarried. And then at the deed, they apologized and wanted to go and mark it out and reprint it because it still had the deed restriction in it saying you couldn't sell it to a Black person. And I said, no.
That's right.
Now I want to jump in. That's
Come on, Rev.
I'm talking about.
You will not mark that out. You leave that in there. I want that document so I can frame it because it's still in a daggone document today.
It's still, that's where I want to pick. Listen, my beautiful Morehouse brother and his wife, both highly educated, one's attorney, one is a psychologist, prominent, PhD, prominent here in this area in California. And they just recently purchased what they wanted was a dream home, but there was a lot of debate and interviews. They were sending videos in of their children. It was all this, and we were, what is all the fuss? They are very gainfully employed. They're very high profile. And when they finally got the property after this long battle, the restrictions in the property deed sold to the other 4 weeks ago.
Wow.
I'm talking, this is very, and I know for our relatives, our white brothers and sisters who are tuning into this, I want you to know that as you begin to engage and become interested in being allies or stand alongside this whole effort to dismantle systemic racism within the United States of America and begin to align yourselves with the causes that will affect and uplift Black people, you're gonna have to face the dark past that we have faced. And it is, I know it immediately kind of rattles you and I can't believe it and all, but let's go ahead and get over that, because that shock, that initial shock is our daily existence in this country. And any type of Black success in the United States of America, any Black success in the United States of America took at minimum double the effort, double the effort of any other achievement. And of course, we know that that's an underestimation. So as we're celebrating Black History Month and the accomplishments of Black people, what we've been unpacking for you on this series is, in this show, is what we've had to crawl out against. So when you're looking at Black success, you're looking at tremendous resilience from the person who's been able to hold down a job and sanity in the United States at the same time and get kids off to school, who've been able to graduate from college. And you're talking about literally resisting the entire system of government in the United States, along with social practice. So that's what you're looking at. And we're kicking off, and this is American history, as has been said. We're looking at a year-long, all year-round celebration of these accomplishments, because this is what it means to start to move past this sense of allyship, where if I get uncomfortable, I can bow out, to one of real brotherhood, one of real, true engagement. There's no backing out. We're building a world that works for everyone, and to do that, I can't be colorblind and blind on the real issues. I've got to get color brave and be able to handle a discussion like this and know that I can still participate. You might lose a few friends and family members who may not want to talk to you no more.
It's true.
But this is where this is where the rubber meets the road. This is the real change. So I'm pumped about this.
Sasha, you want to jump in?
Reverend Kim, you are absolutely right. many of us have experienced generational poverty, right? And generational poverty began from, slavery through Reconstruction, even during the Great Migration, when we thought we were trying to do something, we still lost through redlining, even until the Fair Housing Act. So we're, to your point, trying to rebuild and unpack from centuries of structural laws that really deliberately said African Americans, you're not supposed to own and amass wealth, okay? You're supposed to be utilized, but you're not supposed to get too far. Mm-hmm. Whereas another group of people have had the opportunity to amass over and over. And when equality is, and equality is a word that has been historically used, Brother Malcolm, Brother Martin, our great Black heroes spoke about equality, and actually Martin, and before Martin, Booker T. Washington, really wanted to focus on economic prosperity. Right. And we, right. Equality is nice in concept, but when you're dealing with generation upon generation upon generation of being left behind, what we really ought to be fighting for is equity.
There you go.
There it is.
Okay, that's because equality assumes that we're all working from the same level playing field, and the truth is we are not. Okay, so equity says that we're going to allocate resources based on the disproportionality of this group and help to lift them up to really reach a level playing field. Okay, and so that's why equity, unfortunately, it took, America witnessing the murder of George Floyd and, Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. And yes, 2020 was the year of reckoning. Okay, yeah. But for many of us, this has been going on for a long time. It's been going on for so long. But what we're seeing, and I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but now I think that the conversation around equity is starting to take place, and it's a very important conversation, because that is really where we need to be heading in order to address the disparities that our people have experienced over generation.
Absolutely.
And we have to say the R word. We got to start dropping the R word.
Reparations.
I don't use the word reparations because first dog whistle and people will walk away. I have always called it the invoice, and this is a which is what it is. If we built America and never got paid for it, that's a bill. People understand that. White folks understand debt. That is a debt. But what I want is the debt paid. And I don't want us to not mention at least because, oh my God, Sasha just talked about equity. There will never be equity until you understand that until you have equity in education, you're going to continue poverty. You have the police problems. There is no such thing as equal education if you're giving every kid $7,800, each. So what? When you've got school districts, in Detroit, my God, where you have classrooms without heat and kids who don't have what they need, you're not treating them equally. And you got to bring them up here and then see what happens. And I think the great fear is, look at what we did when you didn't give us anything that we needed. What could we do if there was equitable treatment?
That's it.
I definitely want to do something on education specifically, because the stuff that we're talking about right now isn't talked about enough But one area that is really, really desperate is education. Because
Brian, I just want to, this is great.
Yep.
If I can just tack on to something that Rochelle said, because I agree 100%, because we're I know that we could talk about it and have a special segment around education, but while we're talking about, addressing the disparities, our educational system is completely, misaligned. If schools are going to be built based on property taxes, right?
Hello.
Yes.
Hello.
And
hello.
Property taxes are generated.
That's it.
In communities, high property taxes are generated from strong communities, and lower property taxes are generated from not so good communities, right? Which schools do you think are going to be better? Yeah. Right? I mean, just off of that basic, concept of, education and allocating resources to public schools just based on property taxes, there is clearly an imbalance. Right. Because if property in the Black neighborhood, is devalued as a result of all of these structural racist laws and policies, whereas properties in, white suburbs that were also created and invested in are higher, then there's a disproportionality again. And we are still trying to fight the fight.
Right. Right.
Home ownership, which we don't have, which means we don't get the property values and what's needed to make the schools equal.
Right. Right. And go ahead, Rev.
That whole policy just has to be abandoned because it's structurally unequal. It will never produce any fairness. I started out working with children my mother taught in Chicago's Cabrini Green community. About the project in Cabrini Green. And one of the things that I saw teachers, God bless our teachers, God bless them, coming out of their own pockets to make the classrooms imaginariums and taking on field trips. And what my mother, inspired me to do with the principal is to, they need to come and see college. These kids haven't been on the other side of Chicago. Work something out with the principal, Kevin, so that they can come and experience Morehouse. And so we created what was called the Weekend of Empowerment, and we were flying 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th graders based on Dr. Haki Mahabuti's research around conspiracy to destroy Black boys. We started bringing kids to spend a weekend on the campus at Morehouse College because we knew that it was going to take more than what the resources that were allocated by government in order to get our kids free. We've got kids who come to that program. One is a U.S. federal judge today, living in Washington, D.C. right now, Montez Cobb, and many others who, because of that kind of exposure, that shouldn't have been necessary, right? That shouldn't have been necessary. We've had some home runs, but the housing and the way it's structured right now, based on taxes for folks who don't have money who don't own property to pay the housing taxes, is a setup. It's slavery by another name. That's what everything that we've been talking about is slavery by another name, right? Especially when you're talking about this whole contract housing policy. It's always a way to re-enslave, our people, and freedom is the goal, always.
I'm glad you said that, Rev. I want to kind of bring this home based upon what you just said, because Rochelle, we were talking about this last week, right? Mm-hmm. Where there's a difference between civil rights and freedom. Civil rights is enshrined in the law, right? It's, you fight for a law and you get it passed, and then you have a right where you can sue or seek, reparations for damage that you've been done based upon the law. Freedom is not enshrined in the law. Freedom is inherent. So when you're born, you should feel free that you can do anything that you want to do. I mean, within the confines of a law, but that you're free as long as that you're living your life to pursue joy, happiness, and prosperity. Then there's no problem. Black people, people of color in this country have never really felt that. That's never been inherent for us. And so what we're fighting for, to your point, Rev, is freedom. Freedom to breathe. I mean, when we have children that are born that are having to give that their parents have to give them the talk, or children that are born into communities that are devalued, where they can't, there's no upward mobility for them through housing policy, or they're, and we talked about education. So this stuff is all interconnected, and it all is historic. It all goes back to history, our history. That's why it's important to understand that that Black history, African American history, is American history. It's American history. It's the way it's how our country was founded. And again, it's hard to hear. It's hard to hear about it and read about it and reckon with it, but it's true. It's absolutely true. And there's no way forward without you really understanding that and taking a stand with the people that have suffered so much and gone through so much trauma and continue to go through pain and trauma. So you stand with them, you know your history, and you stand with those folks. That's why we're battling fear and ignorance. Not just fighting it, we're battling it. And we need your help. That's what this show is all about. Go ahead, Rev. I'll let you have a minute and then we'll wrap.
I have to say this. First of all, thank you for allowing me to participate in meeting these brilliant minds, and two, just the encouragement that these conversations are being had out loud and over the internet, and really being disruptive to the old patterns that have kept, if not us, who, if not when, now. Right. And I want to thank Beyond Words, our publisher, who pulled me into this loop. And you mentioned breath, and so I couldn't let this hour in without introducing my book. It was released on February 14th. It's called Breathing Space. And it is a 52-week meditation journey for centered, soulful, and successful living. And the intention behind Breathing Space is really a response that my brother, Reverend Eric Donaldson, and I have to the present double pandemic that folks are living through, and are trying to find methods to remain grounded, centered, and sane during this period. Yes. And so this is a guide. This is something people can do just to step through week by week. And it's available where books are sold: Walmart, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, all those places. And it's available now. And it's our attempt at keeping us conscious during this period with our values intact.
Thank you.
Our values intact.
Thank you, man. I mean, we need it. We absolutely need it. We need it. We need to stay centered. We need to stay grounded. We need to stay in a sense of self-awareness and peace. Mm-hmm. Since we're talking books, I want to make sure I do another little plug for my other friend from Detroit. Yes. Please go out and buy her books. Let me put them up here so people can see them. Please buy The Burden: African Americans and the Enduring Impact of Slavery, and That They Lived: African Americans Who Changed the World by Rochelle Riley. Oh man, I'm on my fourth read of the first one.
Let me take, I know you're almost out of time, to say the most important thing, I want you to buy the book, The Burden, but I want you to think about that burden, because America has spent a century and a half breaking its own laws, which is why it keeps giving itself a slap on the wrist by amending the Constitution. It is time for us to sue. It is time for us to stop it. It is time for us to change that. That's how you get freedom. That's how we actually have change.
Wow, thank you for that. So I want to say thanks to all of you. Thanks to all of you. Rochelle Riley, Reverend Kev, Rev Kev, Kevin Ross, Sasha Gay Angus from Manna, and of course, who had to leave, Jamon Jordan from Black Scroll Network. Make sure you go check out his website too. And because he's doing some fabulous tours within the city of Detroit, you know, the socially distant, so you can learn about the history that's there, but that relates across to many cities where people of color have lived. And so thanks to all of you. Thanks to all of you. With the time they have left, I want to make sure that we tell you about our next event. Coming up on Saturday, March 20th, we are celebrating women around the globe. It's a candid conversation about gender equality and equity and solutions for a better world. So you do not want to miss that. Listen, on behalf of everybody, thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate you being here. Hopefully we'll see you at the next event coming up in March. And until next time, this is Brian Wesley Johnson on behalf of everybody saying thank you for being here. And I'm wishing you a life full of passion, purpose, and high quality living. I'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.